All right, so thank you all for coming today. My name is Ryan Montgomery, and my project is titled Understanding and Managing Musical Worship, an Interdisciplinary Approach. Now, first off, I'd like to thank my advisors from the Interdisciplinary Studies Department, Mr. McAlpin. I think you're probably the best advisor anybody could ever have. I'd also like to thank Dr. Barry Casey, who may still show up today. I don't see him here yet. And Dr. Lisa Cella from the music department, who's here. And both of them have been incredibly helpful. Their insights have just helped me so much. And I've just learned a lot from this experience that I know I'm going to treasure for years to come and use in my career. So, moving on. How many of you have been to a concert recently? How long was that concert? Maybe a couple hours? Maybe if you were lucky, you went to an all-day festival. Well, this is a flyer for an event that was recently held in the DC area that was 50 hours long, non-stop. And this is actually somewhat common in the worship music field. And my career goal is to work in these sorts of events. This event drew over 5,000 participants from around the world. It drew performers that were very, very popular amongst Christian worship circles and made tens of thousands of dollars. So, since this is my desired career field, I have the question, what makes a musical worship experience like this successful, and how can that success be achieved? My methodology for reaching a conclusion to this question was primarily a literature review, but I also did some interviews with industry professionals, and I did journals of some events that I was able to attend. Now, for the sake of brevity, we're going to abbreviate musical worship experience as MWE. So we're going to talk about briefly what is an MWE, interdisciplinarity, the transcendent aspects of an MWE, managing MWEs, a couple of examples, secular parallels, and a conclusion. But first off, what is an MWE? The Archbishop of Canterbury defines worship as the expression of man's heart to God, which seems to be a pretty good definition from the people that I was able to talk to in my research. But that could take any form. Expressing your heart to God could take the form of prayer, could take the form of community service. It could be many different things for many people. But what makes an MWE unique is that it's music. And music is what we call universal language a lot of times. Everybody loves some form of music. And it's an incredible way of expressing emotion without words. So that's the second aspect of an MWE. The third part is the transcendent potential. This is what differentiates it sometimes from other forms of music, is that there's some sort of experience that people get from these events that they don't get in another concert. And they're looking for that kind of experience when they come. And we're going to limit our scope to a corporate Christian MWE. We're not going to look at other religions or individual experiences. So, interdisciplinarity. I used concepts from the fields of music, the arts, sociology, and business for my proposal. For music and the arts, this kind of was more about the content of what actually goes on in these events. Sociology helped me understand how people react to these events and how they interact. And business is more about how these things are presented and how they're managed. Two strategies that I used were advancing through checks and balances and building complex and multi-causal explanations. The first of these integrative strategies, advancing through checks and balances, allows me to weigh different disciplinary perspectives against each other to prevent disciplinary bias. For example, if I'm looking at it from a musical perspective, I'd say that a successful experience would be one that has the biggest band and the best sound system, and maybe it has the best lights or the best multimedia display. But from a business perspective, that's completely impractical. It's going to cost tens of thousands of dollars that are probably way outside the budget for the event. And building complex and multi-causal explanations helps to integrate all these disciplinary perspectives into an integrative conclusion, which is greater than the sum of all of its parts. I get an understanding from combining all these disciplines that I wouldn't get from any one discipline. So the first finding that I have is about the transcendent. And I found this is a very key part of why people come to these events. And they come because they're looking for something. Peter Berger, sociologist of religion, talks about this concept of the everyday reality, that we live in the everyday. And religion often acts as what he calls a symbolic universe for people. It draws them out of their everyday and gives them a greater meaning to live for, something beyond themselves that they really want. Rudolf Otto, philosopher and sociologist to some degree, talks about this experience in terms of what he calls the numinous. It being a non-rational thing that you can't really explain, but it's an encounter with something beyond yourself. He calls it the mysterium tremendum, a powerful, powerful experience with something you can't really explain. A feeling there's something really big and you're really small. And Abraham Maslow, psychologist and sociologist, defines this as a peak experience. Something that people have that emotionally changes them, that they look back to as kind of a mountaintop or a turning point in their life. And a lot of people seem to have these experiences in musical worship. There's other aspects of an MWE which I found to be very important. First off, there's the social aspect. There's a corporate depth and richness to these events, that when you have 5,000 people worshiping together in one room, there's a power just to that. You know, it's a crowd. There's something in the crowd. Another thing is it adds a plausibility structure. If you're in a room where 3,000 people are dancing, you're probably going to be thinking about dancing yourself. If you're in a room where nobody's dancing, you're probably not going to be the only one to do that. You know? So that's a plausibility structure that comes with a crowd dynamic. Musical aspects are an important part of an MWE, and this varies a lot depending on which subculture you're in. Worship often takes the form of rock music in the subcultures I study. But, of course, hymns are very popular in many subcultures, and if you go around the world, there's other ethnic forms of music that are used in worship, and it really can be used in almost any form of music. And then other aspects, worship's often accompanied by other arts. This is why I included other arts in my proposal. Things like dance, multimedia, lighting. All these can be quite important. So, as a potential manager of these sorts of events, and as a career opens up for me, hopefully, what a very important part of this proposal is finding out how to define and reach success in a worship experience. And I came up with 2 criteria to define success. First off, that your audience is satisfied after the event, and second, that it breaks even financially, which both are very important. But audience satisfaction can be really hard to quantify. How do you tell if your audience is satisfied? Well, a MWE is usually a nonprofit. So if your audience is donating to you and you're breaking even, they're probably pretty happy. So if you're able to budget your event in such a way that people come and they donate and you break even, it's a pretty good barometer for whether they're satisfied or not. So reaching that success of breaking even and having a satisfied audience requires a lot of very important business skills, which is stuff that I learned in all my business classes and management classes here. Things like budgeting, effective event planning, marketing to reach a target audience and to bring them into the event. Event management, this includes things like setting up the lights, setting up the sound, making sure the bands have food off stage, making sure they're all there on time, that they know where to go. And all these are business skills which are incredibly important, because these are really just like any other concert, but they have added elements which make them even more complex. A couple of examples, which I'm not going to have time to show, but if you have your own time, you can look these up. Kim Walker, How He Loves Us. This is just one example of a song, very, very popular worship song from an artist in California, which has millions and millions of views on YouTube and has been covered by over a dozen artists. International House of Prayer in Kansas City. Now this example is remarkable in that this is a nonprofit organization that has been holding worship services, usually with hundreds of people there, consistently for nearly 12 years. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. That includes Christmas and New Year's. For almost 12 years. And they're still financially breaking even and sometimes even making a profit. And that's just a remarkable example. And this is streamed live too, so you can check that out. Like, you can watch the live stream anytime you want. A lot of people look at worship and they say, how is this different from, say, U2 or bands like The Fray, Mute Math, and Switchfoot, which are all made up of Christians, but don't play Christian music necessarily. And I find that the main difference is the focus and the audience expectation during an MWE. The focus and the audience expectation is that there's going to be some sort of experience with the transcendent, what Rudolf Otto would call the numinous object. And this is what people get when they come. That's not to say people couldn't have that sort of experience at a U2 concert, or a band like Switchfoot couldn't play worship. But people come to a worship experience looking for this encounter, and hopefully they reach it. So as a successful manager, I need to make sure that my audience is satisfied in this way, they understand these principles, and that I'm able to break even financially. Yes?
So you talked a lot about audiences coming in to an event with expectations. How much, if you had the opportunity, would you have liked to look at a psychological element of the expectation that audience members coming in would have said, hey, I'm coming in with this type of thing, and then what that's going to lead to in terms of my satisfaction before or after the event? Yeah, I mean, in retrospect, I probably should have included a lot more psychology in my proposal, but as it is, it's a large proposal. The psychological element is very strong. I was able to cover a lot of that through the sociology, because a lot of it overlaps, I feel, but I would have liked to have taken more time with the psychological side.
I'm interested in the physics of it. And I know you didn't cover physics, but I know you have a brother who's very interested in physics. When you talk about energy, could we measure the energy in a crowd through the physics of it? Could you measure the numinosity issues through the physics of it? Is there research out there, to your knowledge or anybody's knowledge, about measurement of those states?
Well, I think Rudolf Otto would argue that it's inherently intangible, that it's not something you can really measure. I haven't seen any research to show that any of this stuff is measurable. It seems more like a psychosocial phenomenon, which is very hard to quantify in terms of, electric signals or anything going on in the air. I mean, I'm not a physicist, but I would think it would be incredibly difficult to try to find a way to measure it. Yeah.
Did you delve into the idea of integrity behind a Christian artist, for instance? Because, for instance, for artists like the Fray and Switchfoot, while they are Christians, they aren't expected to play Christian music. And then I guess what happens in terms of the artist and like the experiences you speak of, where there's a certain measurement they're held to in terms of how Christian their music is.
Right. And I think that's part of the audience expectation. When they come to a worship event, they're looking for a band with certain morals that align with theirs. They're looking for a band that's going to portray a certain image on stage that they're looking for, and it's going to line up with what they like. And I think you're going to see that in any music field, really, but particularly in worship. Yeah.
I guess my question builds on what you just said. I feel like people who come to concerts, and we can use a concert like a 3-day Fish concert or something like that, have all of the expectations of their experience that you described.
Right.
That there's a transcendent. They have expectations in terms of the quality of the music, the interactions with the people around them, and with coming away from that being somewhat changed.
Right.
The bands, like Fish, for example, are trying to present new music at every concert, and so I don't quite understand the construct that you present.
That's why I had the slide about.
Any different from something like that.
That's why I had the slide in there about secular parallels and what makes these different. Because I do believe that, yes, it is very possible for someone to go to a secular concert and have that sort of experience, but they have to have that expectation that they're going to do that. And most of the time, when people go to a concert, they're not looking to have that sort of experience. They're looking to a concert for concert's sake. They're looking to hear music. So I think in your case, you might be having a worship experience at a Fish concert or
I
something.
wouldn't call it a worship experience, but
Maybe not worship, but like fitting the definition that I gave in some degree.
and I think people have very high expectations when they go to a concert. First of all, they're paying a lot of money.
It's true.
And I think that, in fact, I have very high expectations of an experience. You know, otherwise it's boring.
Right. But is it a numinous experience? Like, is it something that, as Rudolf Otto would say, is something beyond yourself, something transcendent? Or is it?
Music by definition.
It can be.
That's the goal. I think in some ways that's the goal, is to take a set of, you know, notes and you know, an emotional piece that drives the musician or the composer to write that. So I think that's sort of inherent in music, in a lot, in great music in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you go to an opera or something like that, there's that sort of I would call it something magical that happens on that stage, and the interaction between the, you know, the performers and the audience.
Dr. Chell?
I'm here. I'm not sure I'm going to answer this question well, and you can interrupt me if I wander off. But I would argue with you that a composer writing has his own set of emotional content when he writes the piece. Sometimes the audience knows what it is, and sometimes we don't. But what an audience member gets from a concert is what is inside, what they want to get. Right? So when I go to an opera, I'm not necessarily, well, it's not a good example because there are words, but if I go to, say, a Beethoven symphony, I'm not necessarily getting Beethoven's message. I'm taking my own baggage into the concert with my own set of expectations, and I'm getting it. And I'm getting what I want out of that concert. If the concert is doing everything that I'm looking for has happened. I think, I agree with you that I think music is, it has the ability to have a transcension of some kind. And I think maybe Ryan's point is that you can have a secular transcendental experience versus a religious one, and the experience might be the same on the outside, but the intent going in is different. So I would not go into a Beethoven symphony concert with the idea of having a religious experience.
No, I'm not saying it's a religious experience.
Right.
I'm not, but I'm saying that a transcendent experience.
And I think Ryan
Well,
would agree.
yeah, I agree. But by definition, my study, just for the scope of my study, I did limit it to Christian worship. So I'm not saying my research couldn't be applied to something like what you're talking about.
Yeah,
Just for
yeah.
my purposes, for this study, the scope of my study is limited to Christian
Yeah,
worship.
yeah. No, I understand.
Does gospel music fit into your framework?
Most of the time.
Most of the time.
Not all the time.
What would be a time it did not?
What would be a time it did not? For example, say there's a political event. A lot of times gospel music is used at political events. And then it's looked at as a performance, and the audience isn't expecting to have an experience with it. Any other questions?
All right. Thank you very much.